The first time the woman who signed his paychecks called him her boyfriend David Miller, had a mouth full of prime rib, and her father was staring at him the way men like that stare, deciding between offering a cigar or reaching for his phone. David was a single black man, a private chauffeur in Chicago. He understood Clare Bennett's world and its rules. He never expected one sentence to drag him from behind the steering wheel into the center of it. What would you do if the woman who paid your salary suddenly called you the man she loved? David Miller had a rule about the rearview mirror. He used it to watch the road behind him, not the woman sitting in the back seat. 8 months into this job, that rule had become less about professionalism and more about survival. Because Clare Bennett was the kind of person you noticed whether you intended to or not. Not in the way magazines described her all sharp suits and shareholder meetings, but in the quieter ways. The way she pressed 2 fingers against her temple when she thought no one was watching. The way she'd stare out the window at the Chicago skyline like she was trying to find something in it she kept losing. He'd taken the job because it paid well and asked little of him. After the aerospace company folded, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because defense contracts evaporated overnight, and his name was 3 lines from the bottom of a very long list, David had needed something that didn't require him to care too much. Driving gave him that. 8 hours behind the wheel, a city scrolling past the glass, and enough silence to think without anyone expecting him to produce anything from it. What he hadn't expected was that the silence would become something he shared. It started small. Late nights when Clare would finish a board meeting past 11 and climb into the back of the car without a word, and David would reach over and turn the radio down without being asked. Not off just low enough that the city sounds could fill the space instead. She never told him to do that. He never explained why he did it. It just became the way things were. Then came the conversations that weren't really conversations, more like thoughts spoken out loud to someone who happened to be there. Clare talking about a decision she had to make by morning. David saying something short and practical in return. Neither of them pretending it was more than it was. He knew she drank unsweetened tea when she couldn't sleep after the big meetings. She'd mentioned it once offhand, and he'd filed it away with the same precision he used to file torque specifications and load-bearing calculations back when that was his life. He knew she shivered getting into the car on winter mornings, so he'd started turning the seat heater on 3 minutes before she arrived. Not because the job required it, because he noticed, and noticing felt like the least he could do. Neither of them ever mentioned any of this. One evening, late October, the city lights blurred soft through a drizzle, and Clare had been quiet longer than usual. Then, without turning from the window, she said, "Do you ever wonder if you're running toward what you want, or running away from what someone else already decided for you?" David kept his eyes on the road. He thought about the question the way he thought about structural problems, turning it over, looking for the load-bearing part. "Both sometimes," he said. "At the same time." Clare didn't respond, but something in her shoulders settled, like that was exactly the right answer. Or maybe like it didn't matter what the answer was, she just needed to say the thing out loud. He didn't know then what she was really asking. He would understand it later. The Thursday it changed was raining hard enough that the wipers couldn't keep up. David was waiting outside the Bennett Capitol building when Clare came through the glass doors 40 minutes later, than scheduled, moving with the particular stillness of someone who had just spent 4 hours in a room where every word was a negotiation, and she had lost the one that mattered. He got out to open the rear door. She walked past it. She opened the front passenger door and sat down. David stood in the rain for a moment, then got back behind the wheel. He didn't say anything. He turned the radio off entirely this time and waited. Clare looked straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. "I need to ask you something that isn't in your contract." "All right." She turned slightly toward him, not fully, as if maintaining some angle of retreat. "There's a family dinner this Saturday, at my parents' house. Ryan Ashford is going to be there." She said the name the way people say the name of a headache that keeps coming back. "My parents have decided he's the solution to several problems at once. They've been making that very clear." David knew who Ryan Ashford was, the way anyone who drove Clare Bennett for 8 months would know from overheard phone calls, from the way Clare's voice flattened when his name came up, from the particular brand of tension that filled the car on the nights she'd come from events where he'd been present. "I need someone to come with me," Clare said. "As my partner. Someone who isn't going to turn this into a story afterward or use it for anything. Someone I can trust to just be there." "Why me?" David asked. She answered without hesitation. "Because you're the only person I know who I'm certain won't tell anyone about this." It was a specific answer. Too specific for a simple favor. Not a compliment about his character, a statement about necessity. About something that couldn't afford to become public. He filed that away too, next to the unsweetened tea and the seat heater in the part of his mind that cataloged things he didn't yet have context for. He looked at the rain on the windshield. He thought about the line he'd spent 8 months making sure stayed where it was, the one that kept his job a job and not something more complicated. Crossing it meant walking into a world that operated by rules designed to exclude him before he even opened his mouth. Rooms where his presence alone would be read as a statement and not a welcome one. He looked at Clare. She was holding herself very carefully in the way people do when they're close to something breaking and have decided that composure is the only thing between them and the floor. "Okay," he said. "I'll be there." Saturday evening, they sat parked outside the Bennett estate for 2 minutes without either of them moving. The house was large in the way that old money was large, understated from the outside, impossible once you were in it. Light poured from every window. Clare reached over and began straightening his tie. Her fingers moved efficiently at first, adjusting the knot, smoothing the fabric against his collar. Then they stopped, not because she'd finished, but because something shifted in the inch of space between them. She was close enough that he could see the slight crease at the corner of her eye. The one that appeared when she was concentrating on something she wasn't sure about. Her fingers stayed on the lapel of his jacket for a moment that was 1 second longer than the task required. She pulled back and looked at the house. "They're going to look at you," she said. "Right away before you say anything." "I know. And Ryan is going to try to make you feel like you're in the wrong room." "I've been in rooms where people wanted me to feel that way before," David said. "I'm still here." Clare turned to look at him properly then. Something moved through her expression, not pity and not relief exactly. Something closer to recognition. She opened the car door and stepped out into the evening. As she did, the car key slipped from the center console and she picked it up automatically, turning it once in her fingers before setting it back down with a small, deliberate care, the way a person handles something they're not quite ready to give back. David noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He followed her inside. There's something worth sitting with in the architecture of those 8 months. 2 people separated by a pane of glass that the car's designer had probably never thought about as anything more than a structural feature. Clare in the back, because that was the position of authority. David in the front, because that was the position of service. The glass existed to maintain a distinction that both of them understood without ever discussing. And yet in that divided space they had come to know each other in ways that most people who occupied the same rooms, breathed the same air, called each other colleagues or friends never managed. Clare had no one in her life who stood to gain nothing from her. David had no one who asked nothing from his silence. They found each other not by ignoring the line between them, but by refusing to let it determine what they were allowed to see. When Clare stepped out of the back seat and into the front, she wasn't just changing where she sat. She was saying something that neither of them had words for yet. Here's what this story keeps returning to, and what feels true about it. We tend to misunderstand what courage actually looks like. We imagine it as something large and visible, standing at a podium, walking into fire, making the speech. But most of the courage that actually changes anything is quieter than that. It's sitting in the front seat when you're expected to sit in the back. It's saying yes to something frightening, not because you've weighed it carefully and found it reasonable, but because the person asking is carrying something heavy and you happen to have a free hand. David Miller was not fearless. He knew exactly what walking into that house meant, the looks, the calculations, the silent accounting of what he was and wasn't. He said yes anyway. Not because he'd decided it was safe, but because Claire's fear in that moment was bigger than his own, and he found he cared about that more than he cared about the risk. That kind of choice, the one made not from strategy but from something closer to decency, is harder than it looks, and rarer than it should be. There are choices in life that don't come with right or wrong answers built in. They only reveal what you value when it costs you something. When David agreed to walk into that house, he wasn't choosing recklessness over caution. He was choosing to treat Claire's vulnerability as something worth protecting, even at the expense of the careful distance he'd spent 8 months maintaining. That kind of generosity doesn't require a particular social position or a certain number in a bank account. It only requires a willingness to let someone else's need matter more than your own comfort for one evening in one difficult room. Kindness doesn't ask where you come from. It only asks whether you'll show up. The Bennett estate operated on the logic of rooms designed to remind you where you stood. The foyer alone was large enough to contain David's entire apartment, with a chandelier that wasn't there to provide light so much as to establish a fact about the people who lived beneath it. Staff moved along the edges of the space, invisible by practice. Guests clustered in the sitting room, beyond, their voices low and layered in the way of people who had learned that the most important conversations sounded like nothing at all. Claire walked in like she'd been doing it her whole life, which she had. David walked in beside her, close but not touching, and felt the room recalibrate around his presence, the way a compass needle swings when something magnetic enters its field. He'd expected it. He'd prepared for it. That didn't make it comfortable. What he hadn't prepared for was Ryan Ashford. Ryan was standing near the fireplace with a glass of red wine and the posture of a man who had never once walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged in it. He was the kind of handsome that came from generations of good nutrition and expensive orthodontia. When he saw Claire, something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, not anger. Something more controlled than either of those things. He set his glass down on the mantel and crossed the room. Claire. He said her name with the particular ease of someone who had said it thousands of times in private and in public in ways that contained entire histories. Then his gaze moved to David, not dismissive, not hostile, measuring. I don't think we've met. David Miller. David extended his hand first. Ryan shook it. The grip was firm and deliberate and told David nothing except that this man had shaken a great many hands in his life and knew exactly what he was communicating with each one. Ryan Ashford. He held the handshake one beat longer than necessary, then released it. How do you know Claire? Claire answered before David could. She stepped close to David's side, not performed closeness, the kind that reads as theater, but the kind that commits, and she took his hand in both of hers and turned to face her parents, who had appeared from somewhere across the room with the unerring instinct of people accustomed to arrivals that required their attention.
Mom! Dad, this is David,
she said. Her voice was steady and clear, the voice she used in boardrooms when she'd already decided the outcome. My boyfriend. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret Bennett. Claire's mother, a woman whose elegance was the architectural kind built and maintained over decades, went very still. Her husband Gerald looked at David with the expression of a man running a rapid and private assessment. The guests near enough to overhear developed a sudden intense interest in their drinks. Ryan's expression didn't change at all. That was the part that stayed with David. Not the parents' reaction, not the social temperature dropping in the room, but the fact that Ryan Ashford absorbed the information without any visible disturbance whatsoever. He picked up his wine glass and took a small sip, and continued to look at David with that same careful, unhurried attention. It was the look of someone who had already accounted for this possibility. David tightened his hand slightly around Claire's. He turned to Gerald Bennett with the measured confidence of a man who had spent years in rooms where the people around him were deciding what he was worth, and had learned that his job in those moments was simply to be more certain of his value than they were of their doubts. It's a pleasure to meet you both, he said. The dinner itself was the kind of performance that wealthy families staged when they wanted to appear as though they weren't staging anything. The table was set for 12. Crystal caught the candlelight. The conversation followed channels carved by years of repetition business travel real estate, the kind of charity work that came with naming rights. David sat beside Claire and let the evening flow around him, speaking when spoken to, listening carefully to everything else. Claire played her part well, her hand finding his on the tablecloth now and then, her body language including him in the architecture of the room without overstating it. They had established in the car and in the foyer and in the small signals of 8 months of shared space enough real material to build on. When Gerald Bennett asked how they met, Claire said, "He drives for the company." We started talking. Honest, bare, unapologetic. Gerald's expression shifted through several things in quick succession. David said, "She knocked on the partition glass one night because she wanted to know if I had an opinion about interest rate policy. I did. It went from there." Claire looked at him sideways. That part was true. She had knocked on the glass and he had had an opinion, and they had talked for 20 minutes in the parking structure while she waited for a call that kept not coming. She hadn't expected him to reach for that specific memory. Something in her expression softened in a way she probably didn't intend anyone to see. Across the table, Margaret Bennett saw it. The older woman's eyes moved from her daughter's face to David's, and something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular stillness of a person who has just observed something they did not expect and are quietly revising an assumption they hadn't realized they were making. Ryan waited until the main course was cleared. He'd been patient in the way that expensive, well-trained patience looks, participating in other conversations, asking questions that showed he'd listened to the answers, never once appearing to be waiting. But David had been watching him the way he watched everything, with the quiet, systematic attention of someone whose previous work had required him to find the flaw in a system before the system revealed it catastrophically. Ryan was waiting, and he chose his moment with precision. "David," Ryan said in the tone of genuine curiosity, "I'd be interested to know your read on what's happening with the secondary market right now. Given Claire's position in the fund, I imagine you two talk about it." The table's ambient noise didn't stop, but it thinned. Several conversations nearby lost a thread. David looked at Ryan directly. "We don't talk much about that, actually." "No?" Ryan smiled, easy and pleasant. "What do you talk about?" "The things that don't make it into board presentations," David said. He kept his voice level, unhurried. "What a day actually cost her. Whether something was worth it. The difference between what she decided and what she was pressured into deciding." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "A chauffeur who understands the emotional landscape of a high-stakes investment career. That's a rare thing." The sentence was constructed to sound like a compliment. It wasn't. "Sounds almost like a fairy tale. The practical kind." The table went quieter. Margaret set her fork down. David put his own silverware down carefully without drama and looked at Gerald Bennett. "I'm her driver," David said. "That's not a secret, and it's not something I'd try to dress up. But here's what I can tell you about your daughter." He let that land before continuing. "I've seen her after the meetings where she had to fight for every decision she'd already made 3 months ago. I've seen her work through a problem at 11 at night that she wasn't going to get credit for solving. I don't love the fund. I don't love the name on the building. I respect the person who has to carry both of those things and still figure out who she actually is underneath them." The room was very quiet. Claire was looking at him, not with gratitude and not with the polished composure she'd worn since they walked through the door. With something rawer than either the expression of someone who had just heard themselves described in a way that was completely accurate and completely unexpected. Ryan looked at David for a long moment. Then he reached for his wine. It was later, when this dinner had broken into smaller conversations and Claire had been pulled into something with her mother near the sitting room windows, that Ryan appeared beside David in the hallway near the rear of the house. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood close enough that the conversation was private, and he spoke without preamble. "She doesn't need rescuing," Ryan said. His voice had lost the dinner table polish. This was the voice underneath it. "I want to be clear about that in case that's the story you're telling yourself. Clare Bennett has never needed anyone to rescue her." David said nothing. "What she needs," Ryan continued, "is someone who can stand next to her when the actual weight comes down. Not a dinner, not one evening of holding her hand in front of her parents. He looked at David with something that wasn't hostility, it was closer to honesty, the uncomfortable kind. The moment this becomes public, and it will become public, the weight is going to be significant. And I'm asking you genuinely, not as a threat, whether you're prepared for that. David met his eyes. Are you asking because you care about the answer, or because you're hoping the answer is no? Ryan's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile, not quite. Maybe both, he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking down the hallway. When he spoke again, his voice had the particular flatness of someone making a decision they'd been sitting with for a while. I've known Claire for a long time. Long enough to know that what I just watched at that table, he gestured toward the dining room, was real. Which means I'm out of options that don't hurt her. He looked back at David. So, I'm going to play the last card I have. Not because I think it'll work, because I was asked to and I said I would. He walked back toward the sitting room. David stood in the hallway for a moment, turning the statement over, recognizing it for what it was, a warning from someone who had already conceded the outcome. The document appeared when the guests had thinned, and the evening was beginning to feel like it was winding toward its end. Ryan placed a folder on the side table near Claire with the calm of someone fulfilling an obligation, not triumphant, not cruel, but deliberate. Clean edges, official weight. I think this is relevant, Ryan said. To Claire. Not to the room, though the room heard it. Claire looked at the folder. Something in her face went very still. David had seen that stillness before in the car on the nights when a conversation was happening just beneath the surface of her words. He understood in the way that a person understands a thing a half second before they understand it, that this was what the folder always was, the thing underneath everything else. The reason the answer in the car had been so specific. The reason she'd needed someone who wouldn't talk. The New York contract. Claire had signed an agreement with her family 3 months prior. Bennett Capital would relocate its primary operations to New York, shoring up a collapsing position in one of the fund's major instruments. In exchange, Claire would formalize her relationship with Ryan Ashford within the year. The kind of arrangement that would have seemed medieval anywhere but inside the world that produced it, where it was simply called strategy. She hadn't told David because she was afraid he'd look at her the way the people in this room looked at everything as a calculation, as someone using him as a last act of defiance before surrendering to what had already been decided. Margaret Bennett spoke first, her voice low and controlled. Claire, this isn't the time or place. No! Claire picked up the folder. She looked at it for one moment the same way she'd turned the car key in her fingers on the way in, like handling something she was done holding on to. Then she tore it in half cleanly with both hands and set the 2 pieces back on the table. The room reacted the way rooms react when something irreversible happens, a collective stillness, and then noise, and then the kind of charged silence that follows both. Gerald Bennett's voice came low and serious. Ryan stood without expression, watching Claire with something that might have been respect if the circumstances had been different. He had known David understood now that this was how it would end. He had placed the folder not to win, but to close the chapter he'd agreed to close. Margaret reached for her daughter's arm. Claire stepped back. I'm not signing a revised version, she said to her father, to her mother, to the room. I'm not relocating because it was decided for me, and I'm not going to keep pretending that the shape of my life is something other people get to draw. It was the bravest thing David had seen anyone do in a long time. It was also, he understood immediately, the thing that was going to cost her. They drove in silence for a long time after leaving the estate. Claire was in the back seat. At some point in the chaos of leaving, Coates retrieved terse goodbyes. The particular cold of a house where something has broken the distance between them had reinstated itself. The partition was back in its position. David drove and said nothing because there was nothing to say, yet that wouldn't be wrong. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was flat with exhaustion. The contract. I should have told you. David kept his eyes on the road. I didn't tell you, she said, because I didn't want you to think I brought you there as a piece in something I was already planning to lose. I didn't want you to see me the way those people back there see everything as a set of moves. Why does it matter how I see you? He asked. He wasn't being unkind. He genuinely wanted to know. She didn't answer for a moment. When she did, her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. Because you're the one person who ever looked at me without wanting something from it. And I think I've been protecting that for longer than I realized. And tonight I probably destroyed it. A light rain had started again. David watched the wipers move across the glass. He thought about what Ryan had said in the hallway, not the challenge, but the honest part. That what he'd seen at the table was real. That Ryan had known it too, and had placed that folder not to win, but because he'd been asked to, and had kept his word. There was something in that worth sitting with. The glass between the front and back of the car had never felt so present. He drove, and the city moved past them in the rain, and nothing was resolved, and tomorrow he would have to figure out what came after a night like this. There's a particular kind of secret that doesn't survive the moment you say it out loud. Not because the truth is too large or too damaging, but because the act of speaking it changes the distance between people, closes it sometimes irrevocably. Clare Bennett had kept the New York contract hidden not out of calculation, but out of fear. The fear that if David saw the full picture, he would understand himself to be a pawn in someone else's game and leave. What she hadn't yet understood was that the people who stay are rarely the ones who stay because everything looks clean and simple. They're the ones who hear the complicated version and choose to keep showing up anyway. The thing you're most afraid to say is rarely what drives the right person away. More often, it's the thing that finally lets them see who you really are. He pulled off the expressway without planning to. There was a gas station on the outer edge of the city where the suburbs hadn't quite committed to being suburbs yet, a stretch of asphalt and fluorescent light surrounded by flat dark on three sides. David turned in and cut the engine and sat with his hands still on the wheel. The rain from earlier had returned lighter now, more patient. It ticked against the roof of the car. He could hear Claire breathing in the back seat. He could feel the particular weight of a silence that had gone on long enough to become its own kind of conversation. He got out of the car, not to open her door, not out of habit or reflex or 8 months of professional conditioning. He got out because he needed to stand somewhere that wasn't moving, and the car had started to feel like it was closing in. He stood in the light drizzle with his jacket on and his hands at his sides and looked at nothing in particular. The rear door opened. Claire stepped out. She hadn't been invited. She came anyway. They stood a few feet apart near the back of the car, and the gas station's overhead light made everything look faintly overexposed. Neither of them spoke right away. The rain was cold enough to be felt, but not cold enough to force a decision about it. David said, "I've lost things before." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the dark tree line beyond the lot's edge. The engineering job, not just the income, all of it. The project I'd spent 3 years on. The sense that I was building towards something. I lost all of that at once, and I spent a long time after that making sure I didn't put myself in a position where I could lose anything significant again. Claire stood without moving. Driving was safe, he continued. Not because it was easy or because I didn't want more. Because it didn't ask me to want anything. I could just execute. Show up, do the job, go home. Nothing to lose because nothing was really mine. He turned to look at her. And then tonight I walked into that house with you, and I said things at that table that were true, and I stood in that hallway and got asked a question I didn't have the answer to, and now I'm standing here in the rain, and I need to say something honestly.
Say it,
Claire said. Her voice was steady but only just. I don't want to be a shield, he said. Not for a billionaire, not for anyone. I've spent the last year and a half making myself small enough that I wouldn't matter if things went wrong, and tonight blew that up completely, and I can't decide if that's a good thing or a terrible thing. He looked at her directly. What I know is that I can't go back to driving you to work on Monday and pretending this evening was a professional arrangement. Claire looked at him for a long moment. The rain moved through the light between them. I know, she said, and I'm not asking you to. She crossed her arms against the cold, not defensively, but practically a person standing in the rain who was going to stand there until the conversation finished regardless. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I think I've asked you for enough. That's not what this is about. I'm not cataloging what you asked of me. Then what is it about? He thought about Ryan's question in the hallway, whether he was prepared for the wait. He thought about the answer he hadn't given then, and he understood now why he hadn't given it, because the honest answer required saying something that couldn't be unsaid in a hallway at a dinner party. "Ryan asked me tonight if I was ready to stand next to you when the real pressure came down," David said. I didn't answer him. I'm trying to answer it now for myself. He looked at her, and the answer is that I don't know. I know what I feel when I'm in the same room with you. I know the difference between how I show up for this job and how I showed up tonight. But feeling something and being actually ready for what comes after it are two different things, and I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear just because it would be easier. Claire looked at him for a long time. The rain was steady and quiet around them. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years," she finally said. "Everyone in my life tells me what the situation requires. Nobody just says they don't know." He didn't say anything. "I don't know either," she said. "I tore up that contract tonight, and I have no idea what Monday looks like, or next month, or what my mother is going to say when she calls tomorrow morning. I have no plan. I have never in my adult life had no plan." Something moved through her expression, not quite a smile, not quite the opposite. "It's terrifying. And it's also the first time in 3 years that I feel like I'm standing in my own life." The rain came down around them unhurried. David raised his hand and very lightly, very carefully, tucked a strand of wet hair back from her face, the kind of gesture that has no professional explanation, no version of itself that belongs to the relationship they had maintained for 8 months. She looked up at him. The kiss was not dramatic. It was not the kind that gets scored with swelling music or framed against a meaningful backdrop. It was the kind that happens when two people have run out of reasons not to, and the running out feels less like surrender than like finally telling the truth. Brief, certain, and without any of the theater that the evening had otherwise required of both of them. When they separated, Claire looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something open in it, something that hadn't been armored. "So," she said, "what do we do now?" "I think," David said, "we get back in the car, and then we figure out the rest." They got back in the car. This time, Claire sat in the front. He submitted his resignation on Tuesday. Not in anger, not in the flush of the previous Saturday's emotion, but after 2 days of sitting with the question seriously. The Bennett family's driver position was a good job. It had given him what he needed at the time he needed it: stability, silence, the space to stop bleeding out from the previous failure. But the previous Saturday had made something visible that he'd been successfully not looking at for over a year. He had been using the safety of the job as a reason not to try again. The aerospace contract was gone. That chapter had closed, but he was still a mechanical engineer. He still understood how things were built, how loads were distributed, how structures either held or failed based on decisions made long before the stress was applied. That knowledge hadn't gone anywhere. He had just stopped applying it. He found a space in Pilsen, a former auto body shop wide enough for equipment, cheap enough for what he could put together. He called 2 people from his previous life whom he'd kept in distant contact with. He started small and without ceremony, because starting small and without ceremony was the only way anything actually got started. Claire called on the Wednesday after he left the job. They talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the fund, or his workshop, or the dinner. She told him her mother had called Sunday morning as predicted, and the conversation had been long and difficult, and had not resolved anything. He told her about the auto body shop in Pilsen, the dimensions of the space, the specific structural problem he was trying to solve with the floor load. She listened the way she listened in the car during late nights, fully without interrupting, in a way that made the thing being described feel like it mattered. They started seeing each other the way people see each other when neither of them has a script for it, irregularly, practically, without the architecture of romance that required maintenance. She came to the workshop once with food from a place nearby and sat on a metal stool and watched him work for 2 hours, asking questions when she had them. He went to a neighborhood she liked on a Sunday afternoon and walked with her in a way that no one photographed, because no one had any reason to be looking. The press found out eventually. It took 4 months. The story was approximately as uncharitable as David had expected, and approximately as brief as Claire had predicted. A few weeks of attention, a few pointed questions from her board, and then the next thing happened in the world, and the story became yesterday's version of itself. They got through it. Not cleanly, not without cost, but through it. Margaret Bennett came to the workshop on a Thursday afternoon in March unannounced. David heard the door and assumed it was the parts delivery he'd been waiting on. When he looked up and saw Claire's mother standing in the entrance of a former auto body shop in Pilsen, wearing a coat that cost more than his first month's rent, he set down the coupling he'd been working on and wiped his hands on the shop rag tucked through his belt. He didn't cross the floor to meet her. He waited. Margaret looked around the space with the careful attention of a person who was taking something seriously that they hadn't expected to take seriously. The high ceilings, the organized equipment, the drawings pinned to the wall, the particular order of a workspace that belonged to someone who thought precisely. Then she looked at David. She walked across the floor and stood a few feet away. He understood a woman who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where she held the structural advantage, and she was figuring out how to stand in a room where she didn't. "I didn't come to apologize for what I thought when I saw you at dinner," she said finally. Her voice was level and without warmth, but also without performance. "I thought what I thought, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest." "Okay," David said. "I came," Margaret continued, "because my daughter laughs differently now." She said it the way people say the thing they've been working up to, directly having decided that indirection was no longer available to her. "I don't mean more, I mean differently, like it isn't something she's producing for the room. I hadn't heard that from her since she was young enough that none of this," a small gesture that encompassed David understood everything, "had been placed on her yet." He held her gaze and thought briefly of the moment at the dinner table, Margaret setting down her fork. Something revising itself behind her eyes as she watched her daughter's expression soften. That moment had been the beginning of this one. "I don't know what to do with you," Margaret said. It wasn't hostile. It was honest in the way that people are honest when they've given up on the more comfortable version. "I don't know how to fit you into the picture I had, and I'm aware that's my problem and not yours." She looked at him steadily. "But I wanted to see the face of the person who did that for her. That's why I came." David looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "She did that herself. I just stopped being one more person, expecting her to be something specific." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "may be the most valuable thing anyone has offered her in a very long time." She left without resolving anything. There was no reconciliation scene, no embrace, no declared turning point. But she had come. And she had said the true thing instead of the managed thing. For a woman who had spent decades in the managed version, David understood that this was significant, the beginning of something, not the conclusion of it. Here is what the story of David Miller and Clare Bennett is really about underneath the obvious story. Two people who had each, in different ways, stopped believing their next chapter was allowed to look like what they actually wanted. David had failed at something he'd built carefully and lost through no fault of his own, and the lesson he'd taken from it, the wrong lesson. The one that loss teaches when you're not careful was that wanting things too specifically made you vulnerable to losing them. So he'd scaled down, made himself useful in a way that didn't require him to stake anything. Claire had succeeded at everything she'd been handed and found upon inspection that none of it had been chosen. She was the most capable person in every room she entered, and had spent years wondering if that capability was hers, or simply the product of the infrastructure around her. She'd signed a contract she didn't want because she didn't yet trust that refusing it was something she was permitted to do. What they found in each other wasn't rescue. It was recognition. The particular kind that happens when someone sees you in the process of becoming who you actually are, not who you've been performing, not who you were before. Something went wrong and decides that version is worth showing up for. Success for David stopped meaning stability that couldn't be taken from him. It started meaning work that was his, built from the part of himself he'd written off as inaccessible. For Claire, it stopped meaning approval from a world that had already decided what she was worth. It started meaning decisions she could stand behind when no one was watching. The place they met was not wealth or its absence. It was the shared experience of trying to be honest about who you are in a world that rewards the performance of something else. 1 year later, the building on West Fulton Street had a new rooftop structural system. David's workshop had won the contract 6 months in a mid-sized commercial renovation that nobody would write a magazine story about the kind of work that kept cities standing while the visible things got the attention. He'd gone over the load calculations himself 3 separate times, and they were right. He knew they were right. Claire was already on the roof when he got there. She wasn't dressed for an occasion. Jeans, a coat, her hair down in the wind coming off the lake. She was looking out at the skyline the way she used to look out the window of the car, like she was searching for something. Except now, the searching looked different. Less like loss and more like orientation. Like someone who knew roughly where they were and was simply taking in the view from the new position. David came to stand beside her. She handed him a small box without preamble. Inside was a car key. The key to the company car he'd driven for 8 months, the one she had quietly kept when the fleet was updated. The same one she'd turned over briefly in her fingers on the night they walked into the estate together, setting it back down with that small, deliberate care he had noticed and said nothing about. Attached to the key was a small metal charm. He turned it over. Engraved on the back in small, clean letters, "Every road from here we ride up front." He held it for a moment, closed his hand around it. The city was doing what Chicago does in the early evening, going amber and loud and alive in the particular way of a place that doesn't apologize for its weather or its noise or its history. Somewhere below them, traffic moved. Somewhere below them, the structural system his workshop had designed was doing exactly what it was built to do, holding the weight of the building quietly and without fanfare, the way good structures always do. Claire leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. They had already said the hard things in a car on a rainy Thursday, in a hallway at a dinner that went wrong in the best possible way in a gas station parking lot on the edge of the city with rain coming down around them and nothing resolved yet. This was what came after the hard things. This was the part that didn't require a speech. The most complete kind of happiness doesn't arrive as a reward for suffering through difficulty. It arrives as a recognition the moment you realize that the person beside you has seen the version of you that wasn't performing, wasn't managing, wasn't trying to be what the room required, and they showed up anyway. What David and Claire found wasn't a fairy tale. It was something more durable than that, a choice made repeatedly by 2 people who understood that the distance between them was real and chose to cross it anyway. Not because crossing it was easy, because the alternative, which was staying on the correct side of every line that had been drawn for them, had stopped being a life either of them recognized as their own. Status is real. The weight of other people's expectations is real. The fear of being seen and found lacking is one of the most universal things a person can feel. But none of those things are the final word on what you're allowed to want or who you're allowed to become. The only architecture that lasts is the one built on what is actually true about who you are, what you value, and who you choose to stand beside when the room stops watching. If you were in David's shoes, would you step into that world for someone who saw you clearly? Have you ever had to fight against what someone else decided your life should look like for the sake of something that felt more real? Tell us in the comments. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.